When I started looking at Jerry Miles' federal prison file, I came to a different conclusion. This riot did not start over conditions, and I say this in the book. This riot was the product of a psychopathic mind. And Jerry Miles' federal prison file, 700 pages long. It's enormous. I about fell over when I got this thing in the mail. It weighed about 20 pounds. This man spent time in three federal prisons, a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, and then he spent 15 years almost in Alcatraz, and then a few years after that in Leavenworth, and then he came to Deer Lodge. Now, why did this man want to come to Deer Lodge? He'd been in this, Jerry Miles had been in Montana, what, a week or something, when he committed a burglary in Butte. And he didn't even run. He waited for the cops to come. And when the cops came, he said, "I'm guilty." And I got to thinking, well, why would Jerry Miles come to Montana? Well, he had a cellmate in Atlanta by the name of Jack Floyd Adams. And Jack Floyd Adams and Jerry Miles and another inmate led a mutiny in Atlanta. And then they were sent to Alcatraz because of the mutiny they led in Atlanta, where Jerry Miles was able to observe a riot where, guess what? The rioters grabbed about 20-some hostages and put them in how many cells? 3. How many cells were our hostages kept over here? 3. The circumstances were nearly identical. Well, as I dug into this deeper, I found out that this friend from Atlanta, Jack Floyd Adams, had spent time at Montana State Prison subsequent to Jerry Miles coming here. Now, I can't prove it, but I would bet that somehow they had a conversation or a communication where Jerry Miles was convinced that he could come to Deer Lodge and run this prison. Because he wanted to be inside. He didn't want to get out. That's why I don't believe for a minute that this was an escape attempt. Jerry Miles didn't want to get out of this prison. He wanted to be in this prison. Then along comes this reformer from Wisconsin named Floyd Powell. Now, if you ever thought of two cars sort of driving along at night and all of a sudden they realize they're both on the same side of the road and it's dark, this is about what these two men were doing. We had Jerry Miles he was a con boss in what they call the garment factory, I guess, which used to be where? On the second floor? I think on the second floor of the administration building inside. And Floyd Powell came here and he realized what a mess this prison was. He was going to do something about it. And he brought Ted Rothe with him. And these were good guys. I mean, they knew a lot about corrections, and I think Wisconsin's prisons were much more advanced than Montana's prisons at that time. Well, it didn't take long before Powell and Rothe broke the con bosses. And the truth is, Jerry Miles hadn't been in this prison very long. You know, some accounts say, well, he'd been here like 2 or 3 years. Well, that's not true. He was here only like 3 months before Floyd Powell came here. And he was just getting settled in. I mean, Jerry Miles, he was just a petty burglar. That's all he was. But he was a psychopath. And one of the real fascinations for me when I was writing this book was interviewing one of the hostages by the name of Walter Jones, Jr. He was a sociologist at the time of the riot, and he described what goes on, or what went on in Jerry Miles' mind. Now, because the prison had no classification, the guards didn't know who they were dealing with. Now, this is really frightening, I think, when you think about that. Guards going inside, they're dealing with men who, well, okay, this guy held up a shopkeeper or something, but that's not the full story. The full story is that some of these guys are wacko. Jerry Miles was wacko. Well, then Jerry Miles teamed up with this teenage murderer named Lee Smart. Lee Smart killed a traveling salesman up north on the High Line, killed him with a pair of lineman pliers, bashed him in the head. He was a psychopath. I mean, nobody will doubt that. You look at his record. Well, the tension came about, and we heard about the history of prison riots. There were riots all over this country in the 1950s. Many riots were much bigger than ours, and more people were hurt and more people were killed. And when I was researching this book, one of the reporters, the news reporters who had covered this riot, discouraged me. He said, this was much smaller than most riots in the country. Why would you want to spend your time with this? And I said, because, well, first of all, I'm from Deer Lodge. This is my home. Secondly, this riot is it was full of drama. One of the things that newspapers do badly is write stories based on death tolls. Let's write a bigger story if 20 people are killed instead of 2. And if 300 people are killed, let's write a great big story. But that's not really what journalism is all about. Journalism is about people's lives. Now think of how much worse this could have been if we were just talking about death. We had, at one point, 26 hostages, including the warden, who went inside the walls when he heard something was wrong. Well, I don't think that would happen today. I'll bet you anything the warden would not go close to a disturbance today, but he went inside the walls and got grabbed. All of those men could have been killed. I believe that these men were within hours of being killed. How could it happen that 2 complete psychopaths like Jerry Miles and Lee Smart did not kill all of those men? They grouped them all on Galley 6 in 3 cells. There were 9 men in one cell, 8 men in another, and 3 in another. How could it happen when these 2 psychopaths had rifles with at least 17 rounds of ammunition, and they had flammables, and they had wires? Why did they not kill all those hostages? Well, the National Guard knew how close this was coming down. And that's why former Deer Lodge resident Robert Zaharko was on that north wall by Tower 6. And when the National Guard assault started, he was spraying bullets against the door. The inmates, the rioters were in the tower, and he was spraying bullets to keep them in there so they wouldn't come out and set fire to the hostages or burn them, or shoot them, I mean. So it's really miraculous that didn't happen. But just a little bit more about Jerry Miles. This man, like I said, he didn't want out of the prison. He wanted glory. In fact, Walter Jones Jr. is quoted as saying that right after Ted Rothy's funeral. He wanted glory. He wanted to be known as somebody, whatever that somebody is. Well, he came to this prison, and if he couldn't be a con boss, he would be remembered for the riot here.